Good afternoon. I was going to talk to you today about behavioural science, which is what people used to call psychology. It's essentially the study of how people actually behave rather than how they claim they behave. And I want to talk specifically about its relationship to recruitment advertising. Now, my argument to you today is that this should be of interest for three big reasons. The first is its relevance. A lot of what the key tasks businesses are trying to achieve, getting people to pay a premium, to use their product rather than competitors, to use their products more often, all of these at their heart are behaviour change tasks. So why wouldn't you draw on 130 years of history and experimentation in what makes the most effective behaviour change? So it's a very relevant topic to our day-to-day jobs. Secondly, and this I think differentiates it from much in marketing or business, is that it's robust. It's not based on my opinion or someone else's gut feeling. This is based on the peer-reviewed academic evidence of some of the leading psychologists from around the world. Nobel Prize winners like Kahneman, Thaler and Herbert Simon. So we can give the findings genuine belief and credibility. But then finally, there's also a wonderful range to this topic. There's 130 years of experimentation. There are literally thousands of psychology experiments, behavioural science experiments. And that range means that whatever problem you're facing, there will be an experiment out there that can help you go some way to solving it. So three big reasons: relevance, range and robustness. But despite the kind of strength of those reasons, what I've found often is that some people are still a little sceptical about behavioural science, and they wonder if it's really as effective as some of the boosters suggest it is. So perhaps I thought that maybe the best place to start is just very quickly to show that all of us are influenced by some of the psychological tweaks I'm going to talk about. You, me, everyone. And the best way to show that we're all influenced is just very quickly to go through two of the questions that Louise sent round that some of you answered. And I thought if we went through some of those results, hopefully it proves that we're all affected by these biases. Now, the first question I wanted to take you through was quite a simple one. And on the survey, you were asked, how good at your job are you compared to your colleagues? Now, it was a slightly forced question. You were only given two answers, two options, above average or below average. So if there were a statistician here, they would say the result should be pretty obvious. Roughly half of you are going to say below average, roughly half are going to say above average. But if there were a psychologist here, they would say that's never going to happen. There is a well-known bias of overconfidence. We tend to all think we're better than we actually are. So knowing that, what proportion of you, and to get a big robust sample size other people have asked this week, what proportion of you do you think said you were better than your colleagues at your job? Any guesses? 90%. I like your cynicism. It was slightly lower. It was 78%. But I have seen examples where it's gone as high as 96%. I did a talk to once amongst a group of newspaper salesmen, and 96% of them said they were better than average, which might be my least surprising research finding ever. But it's certainly not a rogue finding. If anyone ever comes to you telling you about a psychology experiment that sounds just fantastical, that sounds too good to be true, always ask them, has this study been replicated? Has the finding been repeated again and again? Now, if it's only been found once, it's probably just a statistical fluke. If the findings have been repeated, then we can give them genuine belief. And overconfidence is something that's been shown again and again and again. And one of my favourite topics and studies in this area was by a Swedish psychologist. It's a wonderful psychologist called Olle Svensson. And Svensson's speciality is driving. Now, none of you are going to be surprised that most of us think we're better drivers than average. But Svensson took this idea to ridiculous extremes. So he went to hospitals, he found people who'd been injured from car accidents, who were still laid up in hospital, And even this group are demonstrably bloody awful at driving. Even a majority of them thought they were better drivers than average. This is something that happens again and again and again. Now, the reason I wanted to start with it was twofold. Firstly, to show that we are affected by these biases as much as the public. But the second reason was it should give us pause for thought about how we better understand our customer. Because what a lot of businesses do is go out and directly ask people what motivates them. And this experiment and many others like it show that often consumers or business decision makers don't have full introspective insight into their motivations or their abilities. People often don't know what genuinely motivates them. A wonderful psychologist called Timothy Wilson says we are strangers to ourselves. It's not necessarily people lie when they answer surveys, but often they confabulate. They try and say the truth, but they often don't know their genuine motivations. So one thing from today would be if you're ever trying to find out what your customers really think, be very sceptical about asking directly. They're very happy to give you lots of answers, but they might not be true. But that wasn't the only question that I asked you. The second question might have been a bit more puzzling. So do you remember the Apple question? Okay, so that was a question that said essentially, how many calories do you think there are in an apple? More or less than 50. And people had to click on more or less. Most people clicked on more, and then they were asked to make a specific estimate. And the estimate on average was 75 calories. Completely fair guess. But if anyone ever sends you a survey saying they're interested in psychology, you should be slightly suspicious because there will always be a twist. And the twist in this case was that only half of you were asked that way, half of you were asked in a slightly different way. So the other group were asked, how many calories do you think there are in an apple? More or less than 150. So not 50, 150. Very tiny change to the question. Most people said less, and then they had to make a specific guess. And what do you think the average answer was in that case? Any guesses? 50. So not quite 50, it was certainly higher. Do you want to be any more specific than higher? No? Okay, fair point. So on average it was 112. Now, a psychologist would say this is completely predictable. There is a well-known bias called anchoring. And it's the idea that when people are making decisions, they tend to be overly influenced by the first bit of information they see, whether or not that is relevant. Now, this was discovered back in the mid-70s by Kahneman and Tversky. And they argued that what happened is that most questions in life do not have an exact answer. You know, there is no exact answer to the number of calories in an apple. You know, how big's the apple? And they argued that because of that, there's a grey zone of reasonable answers. And they said that if someone sees a really high number before answering, they take that as the starting place, they know it's too high, and they begin to adjust downwards. And they stop once they hit the top of that zone of reasonable answers. Whereas if someone's seen a really low number like 50 at the beginning, they know that's too low, but they take it as a starting place, they begin adjusting upwards until they hit that kind of bottom of the zone of reasonable answers. So in our case, 75 calories. So you get this strange situation in which even though everyone knows those initial numbers are irrelevant, because they take them as the starting place and because they don't adjust enough, it ends up affecting their guesses. Hopefully, those two examples show that we're all affected by these tweaks. But of course, it might also open up as many questions as it answers. Some of you might be thinking, well, okay, that's all very well and good for a slightly artificial survey. But in a business critical situation or amongst customers or business decision makers, are these tweaks really going to be as effective? When people have cash at stake or their professional pride, Are these small tweaks going to be as effective when they've got a much stronger vested interest to think things through more clearly? Now that's a reasonably common criticism in behavioural science, but one that's just not true. And I think the way to show that these effects have a big commercial impact as well as one in the laboratory is to think of what is arguably the most effective ad campaign of all time, which I would argue is partially based on a bias. Now, that is of course a very subjective opinion. So over to you. What do you think is the most effective ad campaign of all time? Oh, fantastic. Bog-off. So an amazing campaign that's kind of found its way through most of retail. So brilliant example, but I'd still argue not the best campaign ever. So I want us to think about this slightly differently. So I want you to put your hand up if you are married or have ever been married. Stick your hand up. Okay, so keep your hand up. Now, keep your hand up if you bought or received a diamond ring. Okay, so I think that was everyone but two, maybe three. So thank you. So put your hands down. I think that must be about 95% of you bought or received a diamond ring. Now, I would argue that is the greatest marketing campaign ever, because there is nothing natural about buying a diamond for an engagement ring. Back in the 1940s, people were as likely to buy rubies or emeralds or sapphires as they were diamonds. But then this amazing copywriter, Francis Geraghty, working for the NWA agency, working for De Beers, came up with this amazing line, "A diamond is forever." And she managed to fuse in people's minds the link between the durability of the stone and the enduring nature of true love. So people began to think that the diamond was the natural choice. They didn't even consider other stones. Now, it's an amazing line, often in the top 10 lines ever written in advertising. But as Rory Sutherland says, yes, it's one of the best 10 lines ever written in advertising. But it's still not the best line that De Beers have ever come up with. The best line that De Beers have ever come up with is one based on anchoring. And that's the idea that you should spend a month's salary on your diamond ring. Now, if you stop and think about this for a while, it's slightly ridiculous. Why would you listen to a salesman who has a very strong, very vested interest in getting you to spend loads of money? But just as anchoring suggests, when they threw out that idea of 1 month, people took it as a starting place in their consideration of their spend. They didn't quite spend 4 weeks of their salary, but they started spending 2 or 3 weeks of their salary on their ring. De Beers started to make hundreds of millions of dollars. And because they started to make hundreds of millions of dollars, they decided to push things a little bit. In the 1970s, they went out with a new series of ads in which they essentially said, "Apologies, last 40 years we've made a slight mistake. We've been saying you should spend a month's salary on your ring. What we meant to say was you should spend 2 months' salary on your diamond ring." And again, just as anchoring suggests, you throw out that figure of 8 weeks, people didn't quite spend that much. They started spending 6 or 7 weeks of their salary on their ring. Doesn't even stop there. In the 1980s, De Beers launched in Japan, where there was no cultural norm of buying diamond engagement rings. So there was no messaging out there. So De Beers went out and said, you spend 3 months of your salary on a diamond ring. And now the Japanese spend pretty much more than any market in the world on their engagement ring. A brand has made hundreds, if not billions, of pounds from the simple but creative application of a well-known bias. And when I say billions, that's not an exaggeration. Back in 1939, De Beers sold about $23 million of diamonds in the States per year. By 1979, it was $2.1 billion of diamonds each year. That's a 19-fold increase in sales if you strip out inflation. Arguably the greatest ad campaign ever, partially based on a well-known bias. That should hopefully prove that these biases can work commercially. But of course, you're not working in diamond sales, so you'll want to know, well, how can this affect recruitment advertising? In particular, maybe the topic of today, and video advertising. Now, I want to begin by talking about an idea that stretches back to the 1930s, called the von Restorff effect. But before we do that, I want to show you a genuine American festival poster. So that's for a death metal festival in California, and on the poster there's about a dozen or so bands. And all I want you to do is think, which band do you notice first? Okay? So here's the poster for the Bay Area Death Fest 2. And what people tend to say is they either notice the big logos at the top, or they notice Party Cannon. Now, Party Cannon, who are a death metal band from Dunfermline in Scotland, I think have caught on to something that eludes 90% of brands. And it's the idea that we are hardwired to notice what is distinctive. Now, that isn't just a finding from an American concert. It's one of the most well-established ideas in psychology. It stretches all the way back to the 1930s in the work of this lady, Hedwig von Restorff, a brilliantly named German paediatrician. And she ran a very simple experiment in which she gave people long lists of information. So it had lots and lots of lines of information, and on each line there were 3 digits of information. So to begin with, it might be 3 numbers, 164, next line 721, next line 518, and so on and so forth. But then every so often, quite rarely, she would throw in 3 letters, RJS, and then she was back to the numbers again. She gave people these long lists of information, got them to read through a few times, then she took away the lists and asked people what they could recall. And when people were given long lists of numbers with the odd few letters, it was the letters they were most likely to remember. When they were given long lists of letters with a couple of numbers thrown in, it was the numbers they were most likely to remember. And she showed that we tend to notice that which is distinctive. And this became known as the von Restorff, or the isolation effect. So one strength of video advertising is if we live in a world of text, or that's the norm, one way to get noticed, and it's one of the biggest tasks any advert have, is to deviate from that norm and use something like video. Now, of course, that's about the medium. There are also lessons from psychology about the content that you put in that medium. And I want to talk about an idea next called the Pratfall Effect, which I think is very relevant to the recruitment advertising. Now, before we talk about the academic evidence, I want to do a very quick live experiment. So this is based on the work of an Australian psychologist called Adam Ferrier. And I want to show you a picture of 2 cookies. And I want you to just think, would you prefer to eat the one on your left or your right? Simple? Okay. So here are the cookies. Is that long enough? Okay. So stick up your hand if you prefer to eat the cookie on your left. Okay. And who doesn't care? Okay. Honest. And the cookie on your right, put up your hand. Okay. So I reckon, keep me honest at the back, I reckon 60-40 probably, maybe slightly more in favour of the one on the left. Now let's have a look at the cookies in a bit more detail. And I should say you're in line with the population. So I did an experiment among 656 nationally representative consumers with a lovely researcher called Jenny Riddell, and people prefer the cookie on the left by about a ratio of 2-1, so just like you. So here are the cookies, you can see in more detail. And if you start to look at them closer, you can see that they are almost identical. Cookie on the left is the original cookie with its rough, flawed edge. And then all we did on the cookie on the right was smooth out all the imperfections, make it a perfect circle. Now that removal of the imperfections tends to reduce people's liking of the cookie. And it's an idea called the Pratfall Effect, which applies in categories far beyond food. And it's the idea that we prefer people or products who exhibit a flaw. Now, the initial work for this was done by this man, Elliot Aronson. And he was a professor of psychology in the 1960s at Harvard. And in 1966, he runs his classic experiment. He recruits a colleague of his. He gets that colleague to take part in a quiz. He gives his colleague the answer, so the guy does amazingly well, gets 92% of the questions right, wins the quiz by miles. He looks like a genius. But then, as the quiz is coming to a close, he makes what an American would call a pratfall. So he makes a small blunder, a small mistake. As he stands up to leave, he spills a cup of coffee down himself. Now, Aronson has recorded all of this. He takes the recording and he makes two versions of it. He has one version where it's the entire incident, great performance and mistake. And then he has another version in which he edits out the mistakes, so people just hear the great quiz performance. He plays this to people, and then he asks them, how appealing do you find the contestant? And on all the metrics of appeal, the contestant is rated as being significantly more appealing if people have heard the mistake as well as the great quiz performance. So Aronson calls this the Pratfall Effect, this idea that people or products who exhibit a flaw become more appealing. If you think about the greatest ads through history, not the humdrum stuff that we see on a day-to-day basis, but the greatest ads, what's interesting is how often this insight is used. You go all the way back to 1959, what Ad Age called the greatest campaign of the 20th century, the launch of VW Beetle in America. At the very heart of that campaign, there was the admission of flaws. Ugly is only skin deep. America's slowest fastback. There's a lovely line in here. It's written by a copywriter called Bob Levinson. And there's a line down at the bottom left, you might not be able to read. It says, you can tell them from Volkswagens because a VW won't go more than 72 miles an hour, even though the speedometer shows a wildly optimistic top speed of 90. They went out and told people their cars are ugly. They went out and told people their cars are slow. We've got one of my favourites, stretching this to the extreme, the Hans Brinker budget hotel in Amsterdam, where they revel in their poor service. And now, again, you see, it's not just these few examples. You've also got things like Avis, we're number 2, so we try harder. Guinness, good things come to those who wait. Stella, reassuringly expensive. Again and again, the greatest brands revel in their flaws. You see it in recruitment advertising, the classic campaign from America, one of the most successful campaigns ever for the US Marines. We don't promise you a rose garden, a picture of a psychotic sergeant major scaring the life out of one of the soldiers. Or the Royal Marines did a copy of this with 99.9% of people shouldn't apply. Telling people about the negatives of the job rather than just trying to sugarcoat everything. Now, what these brands have realised, I think, is 3 big reasons why you should consider admitting a weakness in your copy. Now, the first big reason is whether we like it or not, people don't necessarily trust us. They know that we have a vested interest in putting a positive spin on a product or a job. So the great thing about admitting a flaw to that job or that product is that you have tangibly demonstrated your honesty, and therefore all your other claims become that much more believable. So the Pratfall Effect gets around one of the biggest problems of communication, and we encourage people to believe us. The second big strength is it controls where people think the flaw might lie in the product or job. No one thinks they get something for nothing. People know that there are always trade-offs in life. So if you don't go out and admit where the flaw is, it doesn't mean that the person reading that ad will think the job's flawless. They will just think there's a flaw but don't know where it lies. And the danger is they might assume it lies somewhere important. So Rory Sutherland's argued, the copywriter at Ogilvy's argued that this tactic of admitting a flaw to control where people assume the weaknesses was crucial to the success of budget airlines. So he said, look, think back to when a Ryanair launched, or an EasyJet. They were very strange things. Previously it cost you £100 to fly across Europe, now they just wanted a tenner. If they hadn't gone out and said how bad their service was, people may have assumed the cheap price came at the expense of maybe cutting corners around safety. And if they thought that, they would never have stepped foot on the plane. By admitting the cheap prices came at the cost of poor service, people could understand that trade-off, they felt comfortable with it, and therefore they were more than happy to use this new development. So it was a way of controlling where people thought the weakness lied in the product. And then the third strength is if you look at some of these best examples of brands using the Pratfall Effect, what you can see is they don't choose a weakness randomly. They spend an awful lot of time thinking about what's their core strength as a brand, and then what is the weakness that would emphasize that strength. Because in our culture, in many cultures, weaknesses and strengths are often two sides of the same coin. So VW go out and say, yes, we're ugly. But that's because unlike our American competitors, we don't care about aesthetic fripperies. We are solely focused on fuel economy and engineering excellence. Or even Hans Brinker. There's an element of, yes, we're a dive, but by God, you're going to have a good time. So the question for you is, well, what is the core strength of your brand? And then, or the role in fact, and then is there a weakness that you could admit that would emphasize that strength? But where I thought the best place to end any presentation is about a story about peacocks. And the reason I wanted to talk about peacocks was because of a famous letter that Charles Darwin wrote back in 1860. On April the 3rd, 1860, he wrote to an American biologist called Asa Gray, and he said, "The sight of a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze on it, it makes me feel sick." The reason that the peacock's tail so disturbed Darwin was that he felt it contradicted some of his theories. Survival of the fittest. How could this animal, with this ridiculously cumbersome tail that slowed it down so much, how could that be a product of natural selection? And it wasn't until 1975 that the full theories that explain this were fully developed. And it was in Tel Aviv and a professor called Amos Zahavi when he came up with an idea called costly signalling. And Zahavi said the purpose of the tail is to communicate, when it's the tail of the male peacock, is to communicate credibly with the peahen. Now, any peacock can claim it's got great genetic fitness. What a piece of communications needs to do to be believed is to be credible. And what the long tail of a peacock does is offer a signal of genetic fitness that cannot be faked by a weaker male. So only a male that has great genetic fitness, can have this giant cumbersome tail and still survive to mating age. It's a credible signal of its genetic strength because it has a genuine cost to the peacock. And because of that cost, it cannot be imitated by weaker specimens. Now, a few years after Zahavi came up with this theory to explain the tail of the peacock, it began to get increasing recognition amongst economists. In particular, John Kay, who's a professor of economics at St John's College, Oxford. And Kay argued that this same theory could be applied to marketing. He said consumers know advertising is expensive, and they know extravagant advertising is even more expensive. And his argument was because people know that advertising only recoups its investment over time, only a brand with genuine belief in its product would exhibit or use extravagant advertising, or advertising that's perceived to have a cost beyond that which is required just to functionally communicate the message. So what John Kay argues is that the believability of an advertising message corresponds to the perceived expense of that message. Now, experiments I've done have shown that consumers are remarkably well attuned to the costliness of advertising. You know, they know that, for example, cinema might be more expensive than TV. TV might be more expensive than print. Print might be more expensive than search. So people are well attuned to this. So one benefit of video advertising is the perceived cost in the eyes of the consumer. When the consumer or business decision maker realises that expense has been put into the advert, they will know that it's a genuinely important offering from the brand. So one strength of video advertising is it breaks through that clutter of noise and displays a confidence in the brand and offering that mere claims alone can't achieve. Now, those three examples of the von Restorff effect, the Pratfall effect, and costly signalling are just three of probably 1,000 biases and insights that psychologists have identified. So I'm sure that whatever issue or problem you're facing at work, there will be an experiment out there that can help you solve it. Thank you.